Welcome to the channel, thank you for checking out this video. In today's video we're going to be putting the Sony A67 into manual mode, removing all the technical jargon and lingo that confuses people, breaking it down into a simple, easy to understand way so that everybody understands exactly how this can change your photography or filmmaking. So let's jump straight into it. Now if you own a Sony A6700, turn that top dial to the letter M, which stands for manual mode, and then trying to follow along with the video will yield the best results for you. Now I'm going to be recording off an external monitor just for a clearer view, but the display should be similar to the rear of your camera monitor. I'll be pausing the video from time to time to explain different aspects of manual mode and to give you the time to take in the information. Now when you first turn on your camera and set it into manual mode, you'll notice 4 sets of different values at the bottom of your screen. Now going from left to right, our first one is our shutter speed, the second one is our aperture, the third one is our metering mode, and the fourth one is our ISO. Now it's worth me mentioning that the values you see on the rear of your screen are almost certainly going to be different to the ones that I'm showing you now. But there's no need to panic because I'm going to be showing you how to adjust them and what each one does. Let's start with shutter speed. So our shutter speed is the value on the left hand side, and this value represents the speed of the shutter within inside our camera. Now the shutter speed's value is measured in fractions of a second, and as you can see on my display at the minute, my shutter speed is 1/80th of a second. Now there's no need to panic if you can't remember what you was taught about fractions at school. All you have to know is this is a measurement of the speed of our shutter. We can increase the speed of our shutter by rotating the dial on the top right of our camera anti-clockwise. Here you can see the value is increasing as we rotate this dial. The highest speed that we can set our shutter to on the Sony A6700 is 1/4000th of a second, which is incredibly fast. Let's take the lens off and have a look at our shutter at this speed in operation. And at 25% speed you can see the shutter moving up and down across our sensor in exactly the same way that your eyelid opens and closes when you blink. Now we can decrease our shutter speed by rotating that top right dial clockwise. Now you can make your shutter speed go incredibly slow, but let me show you what it does at 1 second. And at this speed we get to see exactly how our shutter works. So why would we want to take control of our shutter speed and stop the camera from controlling it automatically? Well, let's break it down and explain exactly why. Now when it comes to shutter speed, there's only 2 real things that you have to remember. The first is the slower the shutter speed, the more light that hits the sensor. And as a result of this, the more light that hits our sensor, the brighter our image will be. And to demonstrate this, we're going to slow down our shutter speed in this clip, and by watching the image on our screen, you can see that it's getting brighter and brighter until it becomes overexposed. And the second thing you have to remember is the opposite to this, and that is the faster the shutter speed, the less light that hits the sensor. And the less light that hits our sensor, the darker our image will be. And again, this can be demonstrated by increasing the speed of our shutter. So now it's your turn to have a go at adjusting your shutter speed on your camera to get the correct exposure. First off, we're going to have to change our ISO setting, which will come apparent later on when I teach you all about the ISO. But all you have to do is press right on the rear dial, then your ISO settings will be loaded up on the screen. Rotate the rear dial until you get to ISO 100 and then press the center button. And all this has done now is basically lock off our ISO, which we'll be explaining later in the video. Now all you're going to do is rotate that top right dial on top of the camera that controls our shutter speed, and you're either going to slow down the shutter or speed it up until you get the correct exposure on your monitor. Now because my scene was too dark, it meant that my shutter speed was too fast, so I had to slow it down to get the correct exposure. If my scene is too bright on my monitor, it means my shutter speed is too slow, so I'm going to have to speed it up to get the correct exposure. So that's the very basics of taking control of our shutter speed. Let me know in the comments if you managed to get the correct exposure. Now with shutter speed we can look at the more advanced techniques using our shutter like motion blur, etc. But I'm going to save that for a second part, so if that's something that is of interest to you, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel and hit that bell notification. But next we're going to be taking a look at the aperture and how we can take control of this and what exactly it does. So our aperture is our second value at the bottom of our display, and we know this is our aperture's value because it has the letter F before it. Now we can control our aperture with the body of our camera, but the aperture itself is not built into the camera, it's actually built into the lens. Let me show you how it works. So here you can see me opening up the aperture on this lens. In exactly the same way the pupil of your eye opens to let more light in. We get to control the aperture via the front dial on the hand grip of the Sony A6700. Now by turning this dial counterclockwise or clockwise, either opens our aperture or closes our aperture. Now when we turn this dial to close our aperture, the value on our screen increases, just like so. And when we start to turn that dial in the opposite direction to open our aperture, the value decreases. Now depending on what lens you're using decides how large our aperture can go or how narrow it can go. Now if we take a look at this lens here, we can see that it has a maximum aperture of f4. And compared to this lens, this one has a maximum aperture of f1.4. This second lens has the larger aperture of the two. And because this aperture can go wider than the previous lens, you may hear people referring to it as a faster lens or faster glass. But how does our aperture affect our photography? Let me show you. If we begin to lower the aperture value on our screen by rotating our front dial counterclockwise, we begin to open the aperture on our lens, which means we're letting more light through our lens, brightening our image. If we rotate that front dial clockwise, we begin to close the aperture in the lens, meaning that less light can come through into the camera's sensor and thus darkens our image. So the two key points of your aperture to remember are, the more open your aperture is, the more light you are letting hit the sensor and the brighter your image is going to be. The more closed your aperture is, the less light you are letting hit the sensor and the darker your image is going to be. And here is exercise number 2 that you can follow along with and have a try to see if you can get the correct exposure by altering your aperture. So first off, you're going to set your ISO to 100 as described in exercise 1. Then you're going to set your shutter speed to 1/25th of a second by rotating the top rear dial. So now we've locked off our ISO and we've locked off our shutter speed. Now we're going to adjust our aperture to try to get the correct exposure. Now you're either going to open or close your aperture depending on your lighting environment. But if you can get the correct exposure by adjusting the aperture, then perfect. But if you can't, for example say that the screen is still too dark and your aperture will not open any further, then we're going to have to go back to our shutter speed and alter the speed of the shutter to get the correct exposure. And this is a great way of practicing using our shutter speed and aperture. What you do is change the speed of your shutter and then try to adjust the aperture to get the correct exposure. And if you find that the aperture cannot get the exposure correct, then you go back to your shutter speed and adjust this to get it correct. So we're using both our shutter speed and aperture in unison to get the correct exposure for different settings. Now we will be releasing a second part to this video, which will be released very soon. We'll be looking at more advanced techniques using the aperture and shutter speed. So if this is something of interest to you, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Next we're going to be taking a look at our metering mode and explaining exactly what it does. And you're going to be glad to hear this is going to be the easiest one to remember and the easiest one to use out the 4 values on the bottom of our screen. In fact, it doesn't need much explaining. Let me show you exactly what it does. In this example, I'm closing our aperture and you will see that the metering mode goes to -2. This is because we've gone underexposed. Our image is too dark. As I begin to open up the aperture again on the lens, keep an eye on our metering mode's value and how it changes in comparison to the brightness of our image. And as you can see here now, our image is too bright, and we know this also because our metering mode is displaying a positive number of 0.7. When our metering mode is displaying a positive number, it means our image is too bright, and when it's displaying a negative value, it means our image or scene is too dark. And when our metering value is at 0, this is indicating to you that the camera thinks that our scene is correctly exposed. But the thing to remember is, whilst our camera thinks that our scene is exposed correctly, it's not as reliable or accurate as your human eye, so bear this in mind. It's also worth me mentioning that not only does our metering mode adjust as we change our aperture, but it also is affected by our shutter speed and our ISO. And talking of ISO, we've reached the final chapter of this video, so let's see what our ISO does. So you should now have a little bit of a grasp of how the shutter works and our aperture, and how they work in unison with each other. Well, the ISO is no different. It works alongside our shutter and aperture to get the correct exposure that we want. Now you should know how to open up your ISO settings and how to adjust the value of the ISO by rotating the rear dial. So what is our ISO value and what does it represent? Well, it represents how sensitive our camera's sensor is to light. Or to put it into simple terms, the higher the value of your ISO, the brighter your image is going to be. But you might be saying to yourself, hold on a second, you've already shown us how to adjust the shutter speed to brighten up our images, and you've also shown us how to adjust our aperture to let more light in, which also adjusts the brightness of our images. So why do we potentially need a third way to brighten up our images? Well, there's going to be times of the day, especially in the evening and at night time, where the aperture on your camera lens or the shutter speed cannot be adjusted enough to take into account the light environment. So we have to adjust the ISO. So in exercise 3, we're going to simulate this situation and show you how to adjust the ISO to correct it. And because we now know how to adjust our aperture, we can restrict the amount of light entering our lens. So we're going to start with an ISO of 100 and change the camera's aperture to f7.1. And now what you're going to do is increase the camera's shutter speed until the image on our screen goes completely dark. Now, depending on the environment you're currently in, this will obviously be a different value to the one that I'm using. But with a shutter speed now of 1/100th, our ISO set to 100, and with an aperture of f7.1, we've simulated a low light environment. Now what we're going to do is, by pressing right on the rear dial, is open up our ISO values, and we're going to increase the ISO value until our meter reading gives us a value of 0. So in this scenario, I need to raise the ISO level even more. And there you have it. In this particular environment, I've had to raise my ISO level to 4000 to get the correct exposure. Let me know how you got along in the comment section below. Now I'm going to leave you with one very important piece of advice for your ISO value, and this is important to remember. Try to always keep your ISO value to the lowest possible to maintain image quality and to suppress digital noise. And if you don't know what digital noise is, it's this horrible grainy stuff that sometimes you see in your photos. Right, I think I've probably overloaded you now with information, so if you've made it this far through the video, very well done. What I would recommend is watching this video through a couple of times, doing all the exercises until you get comfortable with them, then head off out with your camera and just keep practicing. What will happen over time is you'll see the correlation between your shutter speed, your aperture and ISO, and how they work together to get the correct exposure. Once you've mastered the exposure side of it, you'll find there's ideal shutter speeds, apertures and ISOs for different situations. And that's where part 2 of this video is going to come in, with more advanced techniques using our shutter speed, aperture and ISO. We've also got part 2 of our street photography course, which is due out soon, And we've also got a review of the monitor used in this video. So if this sounds interesting to you, make sure you hit that subscribe button, turn on them notifications, and give this video a big thumbs up. We'll catch up in that next video. See you soon, everyone. Oh, and whilst you're here, why don't you check out this video also? See you soon, everybody. Thanks for watching.